Okay, so we're skipping a few decades. So that was back in the 1980s. I worked at Simon and Schuster, and then I moved out to California and worked as an acquisitions editor for Harcourt Publishers, and that's where I really started developing my own authors and publishing books and doing profit and loss statements on each book. Understanding the real nuts and bolts behind publishing. So I was in publishing there for a long time, and then of course I started writing my own books, and we can talk about that, the Elizabeth Chase novels. So it wasn't. It was many. It was much far later. Yeah, I've always loved business. I think business is fascinating and everybody works, just about everybody works. And the problem with business books before Ken Blanchard came along is they were dry and boring and they tended to have this sort of top-down management style is cool. And here comes Ken Blanchard, and he's all about side-by-side leadership and encouraging people. And I just, that really, really appealed to me. The idea that you can make the world a better place by how you work with people. And we all work with people. So that was really appealing to me.
And I mean, how long did you two work together over the course of time?
Well, I started working with him, and he has authored. Now, you've authored 60 books, so this doesn't seem like a big deal to you, but Ken has authored 70 books. And most of those books, interestingly, have been co-authored. The One Minute Manager was co-authored with Spencer Johnson, who also wrote Who Moved My Cheese, another massive bestseller about, change and how uncomfortable change is. These were wonderful. They invented the business parable. Instead of a dry, boring book, you'd pick up a book and you'd start reading a story. Like, for example, The One Minute Manager, it's about a guy who's looking for an effective manager, and you get caught up in the story. You're not being lectured to. And, so that was really fun. So I started working with Ken. I basically just worked as his editor on all probably I lost count around 30 of how many books we have worked on together. And at some point, he'd been teaching all this incredible leadership theory. He was a professor long before he was a businessman and a best-selling author. He had developed some organizational leadership ideas back at the University of Massachusetts. And what happened was somebody heard him speaking. He was an incredible public speaker, and they said, you have to start your own company. And he said, I can't even balance my own checkbook. How am I going to start a company? And they said, we'll help you. So these presidents helped him start his organization. But what inspired me to write this novel, I mean, not novel, I'm back in Elizabeth Chase land. What inspired me to write this biography is that there are a lot of biographies about really fascinating people. You know this, Jake. People who, I mean, I'm thinking like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, any number of business scions, and they're fascinating, innovative people, but they're not necessarily great role models. And working alongside Ken Blanchard, I was able to see that everything he taught, he was living that. When he talks about servant leadership and getting your ego out of the way and serving others so that they can be magnificent and achieve their goals, that is what he does. That is who he is. So that's what really inspired me. He really wanted to be a dean. He thought he would have an academic career. And they told him in college that he couldn't write. They said, you either publish or perish, and you're going to perish because you don't write well. Well, it's because he had this breezy, easy to understand style. He is able to take complex ideas and make them really understandable to a person who has a sixth grade education. And as you know, that's not academic writing. So he goes on to become one of the best-selling business authors in the world, and he's told he can't write. So yeah, that's a great story right there about don't give up, don't buy the bad press about yourself.
And then there's also other moments you talk about here. The effect of his sister's death. He loses his beautiful home in a wildfire. Tell us about some of the other just adventures and turns in the story that you.
Yeah, well, so yeah, to finish the story about wanting to become a dean. So he was at the University of Massachusetts. He finished his PhD, and he interviewed with several universities to see if he could get into that university administration career. And he had some great interviews, and but never heard back from anybody. And he finally called the guy from Dartmouth, who he felt he had a real connection with, and he said, "Hey, I thought I'd hear from you." And he said, "Ken, I'm so sorry. I really liked you, and I've been meaning to call you. We loved you, but you have two really horrible recommendations in your personal file." And those were the days when, the Freedom of Information Act wasn't in effect, so you couldn't see your personal file. And he said, "Really? Who are they from and what do they say?" And they said, "Well, one's from the dean." And he said, "Ken Blanchard's a great guy, but don't let him anywhere near the faculty. He doesn't have any academic interest." And the other one said, "Yeah, Ken's wonderful with students, but he's not particularly intelligent." And so that was pretty devastating. I mean, I think a lot of people would be that would probably shut them down. But his mother had taught him that life often hands you challenges, and the trick is to not mumble and look at your shoes, but to keep your head up and look for opportunities. So he just, told people what he was going through, what he wanted to do, and he eventually got a call from a guy who knew someone at the University of Ohio, and he went there and took a position there, and that led to him writing his first textbook and becoming, who he is today. So that was a tough one. He had a sister who was brilliant, and she was a year and a half ahead of him in school. She taught him how to buckle down and be a good student, and he pretty much worshiped her. And unfortunately, she succumbed to alcoholism, which I have to say there, but for the grace of God go I, 38 years sober, thank you. And she passed away at 42 from her disease. So that was another blow. So it's not like he's had the perfectly charmed life. As you mentioned, he during the fires of 2007, his home was burned to the ground, and what he took away, this is just classic Ken Blanchard. He has this amazing ability to reframe reality in a positive light. And what he said was, when you give something away, it tends to come back to you. And everything that he and Margie had given away, his wife Margie, people started giving back to him. He had signed basketball from John Wooden, who John Wooden sent him another one. And, people just really rallied around him. And then, wouldn't you know it, the house across the street that they'd admired for so many years went up for sale, and they were able to buy that house, which was a bigger house, better view, and it was less money than it would have cost them to rebuild. So that's his philosophy, and that's the way life treats Ken Blanchard. It's pretty inspiring. It's interesting about inside organizations. A lot of times you'll have a really talented individual contributor. They're really great at their job, and somebody will take that person and promote them into management, and they don't know the first thing about how to manage people, right? And so, especially after the Industrial Revolution gave way to the knowledge economy, you really need to find a way to lead people, intelligent people. And so there was a big market for Ken Blanchard to teach what he had been teaching in college. And so he started this organization, and they train it's huge. They train everyone now, from an individual looking to improve their individual skills, to a giant organization who might want a big initiative to train 30,000 employees. So Ken built this whole organization, and the reason he wanted to build a company, this is really interesting to me. He and his wife, they could have just been business consultants and gone around like many do to companies and tell them what to do. But they wanted to start their own organization so that they would have the same problems that a Netflix or an Apple or a Google or a Microsoft has, right? They will have the same problems because they've got a bunch of employees and they've got an HR department. And so I think that's what really has kept Ken's leadership training relevant over the years is that again, they walk the talk. Fortunately, at first, when I knew I wanted to write his biography very soon for the reasons I've told you, that I could see that this man, he's not only contributed this to the world, but he's really living this way. He's a genuine role model. And I floated the idea of writing a biography, and people really weren't that thrilled about it. It's like, no, yeah, well, Ken doesn't have much of an ego. It's like, it's not about me. He didn't really necessarily want a book written about him. But he was fine with me going into his old journals, his old correspondence. I read his old uh, doctoral dissertation. I mean, talking to people that he knew back in fifth grade, the people who knew him before he was famous. And that was really, really fun. One of the things that blew me away and I thought was very interesting about his story is that when he was in grade school, schools were still segregated. He was in grade school in the early 1950s, and it wasn't until he was in high school that the Supreme Court handed down the desegregation decision. So he went to a segregated grade school, but he was a basketball player and he's a very inclusive personality. And he made a lot of black friends when he was in grade school. So by the time he got to high school, a desegregated high school, he was already very comfortable associating with all different kinds of people. He had friends from every group. And one of the documents that I ran across, because I had heard about that, but it's one thing to hear about it and it's another thing to find the document, right? So I found an old newspaper clipping from 1956. He and his friend Bobby Bradshaw, who happened to be black, they had started an organization called the Youth Fellowship. And their idea was to bring the high school together and bring all these different cliques together and sort of get rid of all this siloing by race and ethnicity. And, it was incredible to see, wow, talk about a guy before his time. 1956, here's a newspaper article showing Ken and Bobby, and an article talking about what they were trying to do in high school. So that's actually in the photo section of the book. We cleaned it up and put it in there.